Good afternoon and evening to all those of you joining us from Asia and Africa. I'd like to welcome you to the fourth webinar of the Gender and Agriculture Research Network. This webinar is based on a recent working paper that we released. Before I go on, just one sort of main housekeeping tool is that I will be muting everyone else to make sure that we don't have any background noise and to ensure that we have good quality of this call for you. And also, I'm Martina. I'm the communications coordinator for the CGIAR Gender and Agriculture Research Network. And today we have a presenter, Smriti Rao, who will be taking us through the webinar today. Smriti prepared the working paper that we recently released, and she is currently an associate professor of economics and global studies at Assumption College and a resident scholar at the Women's Studies Research Center at Brandeis University. And we also have Cheryl Doss, who will be moderating this webinar for us. Cheryl is currently the gender advisor to the CGIAR research program on policies, institutions, and markets, which is led by the International Food Policy Research Institute, CGIAR Center. So before I hand over to Cheryl, just two housekeeping notes. So one is, of course, we will mute everyone except for the current speakers. And if you have a clarifying question during the presentation, please post that in the chat, which you will see on the right-hand side of your toolbar. If you are having any issues, please let me know. Then actually have the question and answer session, which will take place after the presentation. So first we will have Cheryl, who will give you a little bit of background about the working paper and the process for it and the need for it. And then we will have Smriti, who will speak for about 30 minutes, after which we will have another 30 minutes or so of Q&A. So once again, if you have a clarifying question during the presentation, please put it in the chat. But afterwards, if you have any other questions, please hold until we open up the floor after the presentation. Okay, Cheryl, over to you.
Very much. I thought what I would do is just put this in context a little bit. Some of you may know that members of the Gender Research Network met in May 2014 to try to think about what kinds of recommendations we wanted to measure the gender and empowerment IDOs for the CGIAR. The two that we were really particularly looking at were increased control over resources and participation in decision-making by women and other marginalized groups. That was the wording at that point. So we commissioned Smriti to write a background paper looking at all of the evidence and all of the other related indicators that have been done to try to figure out what data has been used and to come up with some recommendations of what the CG might choose to use. It's worth noting as she goes through this that she's not, and you would have noticed as you heard her introduction, she's not primarily a CG person. We thought that it would be really useful to have somebody from outside the system to take a look and provide some input into this process. There's some of us who have been working on this issue for quite a long time and keep saying the same things, and so we thought it would be good to have somebody else. So this is the recommendations and what she has come up with, and this will be part of broader discussions among the gender network about what we should be recommending. So let me turn it over to Smriti.
Hi, I hope everybody can hear me, and I am just going to share my screen now. Is that right? Let me see, 1 sec, sorry, let me just, okay, can everybody see this? I hope so. Okay, excellent. So yes, thank you so much, Cheryl, for and Martina for the introduction and for inviting me to write this paper and to present these ideas in this webinar. And thanks to all of you for logging in and participating. I think the ideas presented in this paper are an attempt to think through some of the issues that arise when we try to, recommend some indicators and data that we would like to see collected. And they're not meant to end the conversation and debate. They're meant to further it, hopefully clarify some aspects of it. So your comments and your feedback are really important. So I look forward to a very lively Q&A. I'd like to begin by just sort of summarizing what the motivation for this study was. And I think the motivation was that while there is increasing demand for tracking the gendered impacts of agricultural projects that CGIAR and its affiliates, are implementing on the ground, there's a lack of simple and robust indicators, particularly at the national and international level, that would allow us to do this kind of tracking in a way that can then help us course correct some of these projects where they have unintended gender consequences. And so, this study was an attempt to try to fill some of that gap or make suggestions on how to fill that gap. So just to clarify, indicators are constructed by organizing data analytically, of course. And I think the idea of an indicator is that it allows you to make decisions. It enables decision making. And in this case, since the focus is really on the impact of projects, the indicators should help us make decisions about whether the project needs to be modified in some way based on these gendered impacts. It turns out that if you put yourselves in the shoes of a project manager, and many of you probably are, as you know, I'm an outsider to the CGIAR, but many of you have, had to think through this, and you're a project manager. Let's say you're implementing a new seed variety, and you're interested in how this changes women's access to land. That's how you sort of put it to yourself. And then you start thinking about, well, how would I go about measuring this? Well, it turns out there's a bunch of conceptual issues you need to first clarify before you can move forward. For example, what do you mean by access to land? Do you mean that you want women's names on deeds to the land, the de jure ownership of women should increase? Do you mean that they should be able to participate in decision making about how to use the land, which is a slightly different way of thinking about access and control? There's these conceptual issues that arise around what these categories mean. And then secondly, of course, at the next level, once you clarify that meaning, you have to figure out how to go about collecting the data. And so there's a host of measurement issues. For example, can we interview just men and collect the data that we need, whether it be about ownership or control? So there are conceptual issues and there are these measurement issues. And we really realize that we can't begin to recommend indicators without really spelling out what the main conceptual criteria and the main measurement criteria are that we think these indicators should fulfill in order to be useful. So perhaps, one of the main contributions of this study, and again, your comments and your thoughts on this are very welcome, is to try to spell out some of these criteria. And we spell out 5 conceptual and 5 measurement-based criteria. Obviously, the list could be longer, but these are the 5 that seemed to rise to the top when we reviewed the literature. And of course, in order to do so, there's also a review of some of the literature that uses gender gap indicators for various different resources in agricultural settings. And I should note that I mainly focused on peer-reviewed published studies. And also that most of these studies remain small scale, so they cover a few villages, a sub-regional unit. There really are very few that are studies at a national or international level. And so, even many of the indicators we suggest haven't really been tested at that national or international level. So that's a sort of interesting point. So then we actually recommend some indicators. It's sort of a menu. That's how we think about it. There's 39 of them disaggregated by resource type. And finally, in the course of doing so, we of course talk about some of the sources of national and particularly international level data that are currently available. But then given the paucity of the data, we of course also have suggestions for data that should be collected in order to feasibly construct these indicators. So actually, let me pause. I said I would pause every now and then to make sure that, I'm not missing any clarificatory questions.
You're okay.
Okay, great. All right. So today I'm mostly going to focus on these conceptual and measurement criteria and sort of look for your responses to those. We will not discuss all 39 indicators. That would take too long. But, I'll sort of present a subset to give you a feel for what the indicators look like. And then, of course, we'll have our Q&A session. Before I get into the criteria, I thought I would also try to kind of point out what the scope of the paper is, both what it is, but also what it is not and what it does not cover. And the central unifying question here, as at least we were thinking about these indicators, was what are the gender gaps in control over key resources in the agricultural production process? And so no surprises, of course, we're talking about an agricultural context. And so, in part in the task that the CGIAR kind of gave me when they invited me to join this project, they spelled out a number of resources they were interested in: land, livestock, interestingly, common pool resources, which are often not part of the discussion. So I thought that was really interesting: financial assets and labor power. And then a couple of other axes of control: household income and the ability to participate in extra-household collective decision-making processes. So, for example, community or local level government, or even, maybe an indicator for national level participation in national level governance processes. So these were the various axes that, these are the various axes that the paper explores. And there's obviously others that one could talk about, but that are not included in this paper. And then secondly, we use this word control, and I would like to come back and talk about that a little more. And then we talk about gender gaps. So of course, what this suggests is that we're interested in the difference between male and female control over resources. However, even though we're interested in the gender gap, we know that gender gaps can narrow for all the wrong reasons. So, for example, rural households are becoming increasingly impoverished. Land grabbing is causing them to have less land than they had before. And most of the land that is being lost used to be owned by men. In this context, gender gaps would narrow because men now have less land than before, but women don't have more, and households as a whole are less land rich. So, of course, this is not the outcome we seek. So what we suggest here are a separate indicator of female control and of male control, and we provide some suggestions on how to combine them into a single gender gap measure. But even in using that gender gap measure, we do urge that we kind of look at the disaggregated versions to make sure that we're not in this race to the bottom situation. And then the unit of data collection is the individual within the household. That is who we recommend be surveyed. So for example, if we are talking about financial assets, the indicator we might recommend is the percentage of women and the percentage of men who are part of microfinance groups and savings groups, rather than the number of groups per district, which would require sampling of the groups themselves, right? So our data, our indicators are all based on surveying and interviewing individuals within households. And then last, but certainly not least, this is a question that was submitted by somebody when they registered for this webinar. And this was actually my first question when we started this project, which was, given all of the work that has gone into constructing the WEA, how does this project overlap, not overlap with that project, which is obviously really interesting and which we actually reference a great deal in this paper, and it's an extremely useful project. So this is not an effort to measure women's empowerment. I think that is not the goal here. The goal here was to really think about project impacts in a somewhat targeted way. So again, if you put yourself in the shoes of the project manager for a new seed variety, he or she might be able to draw a very straight line between their project and what happens to patterns of land use or water use. And so what he or she might really be interested in knowing is how those patterns of land use or water use are changing in the short to medium term, let's say in a 3 to 5 year span. Empowerment, on the other hand, is really an aggregate concept. And it may be much harder to draw a straight line, although obviously aspects of empowerment and the WEA itself are closely linked to control over these various resources. This is a somewhat more disaggregated attempt to provide a menu of indicators that project managers can draw upon, alongside watching what's happening to the WEA. So we really see this as a complementary set of indicators, and one that is much more specific to targeting the impacts of particular projects in ways that project managers, or along axes that project managers think are suitable. Just to kind of state the other corollary of all of this, which is just because patterns of land use change in a particular way, that may or may not mean that women are more empowered. So for example, just because women are working more hours on the land, or even if women have more decision-making power over the land, that's one aspect that you may be measuring with this particular indicator, and that's, good for your project, but women may be losing ground in other respects. And, so there may not be a one-to-one correspondence between what happens to the aggregate empowerment measure and what's happening along these specific indicators. So that's another thing to keep in mind. So this is really not an effort to measure women's empowerment as a whole. Let me pause there as well and see if there is any questions.
I don't see any, thanks.
Okay, all right, great. Okay, so these are the 5 criteria we came up with, which relate to these conceptual issues, and I will go over each of these in turn. And again, they are drawn out of the literature on these issues. And similarly, we have 5 indicators that are related to measurement issues. Give us the nice round figure of 10. And again, we'll go over each of these in turn. So let's start with the conceptual issues, and the first one in particular, which I thought was really interesting. And so again, if we go back to that project manager, and he or she is trying to think about, very generally wants to know what's happening to access to land. And, it's sort of posed in that very general way. As I mentioned, we have to think about what that actually means. Do we mean de jure ownership? Do we mean women's ability to participate in decision-making about the land? Or do we mean, that she is able to, use the land, physically be on the land, and, engage in activities on the land? So in mainstream economics, property rights have traditionally been defined somewhat narrowly. So you have rights over a resource if you can alienate the resource, that is, you have the power to buy, sell, transfer, lease it, and or you have the right to exclude others from using the resource. So there was a somewhat narrow definition of property rights that is in the sort of traditional mainstream economics literature. And this has been questioned over the years by people from the common pool resources literature, but also, of course, by folks working on gender and folks working in developing country contexts, where, for example, the right to alienate may not mean very much in the absence of markets for renting and selling this resource. So there's a really useful framework that has been used within the CGIAR by Agnes Grisenbing and others, and is in turn based on some of the literature from Elena Ostrom and others. And this is borrowed from a paper by Johnson and Grisenbing. And this was, really useful because, of course, what it spells out is the different levels and layers of rights that one can have to a resource. And the first most basic is simply physically accessing the land, using the resource, which may or may not mean that you have the right to withdraw output or control income that is the result of selling the output or of the activities you engage in on the resource. So there are rights to access and there are rights to withdrawal, and these are grouped together as use rights. And so it seems, from the literature that it would be useful to have an indicator of what's happening to patterns of use and use rights, because, these might be one level of impact of a particular project, right? And this might be, related to, but somewhat distinct from what happens to what we are calling control rights or patterns of control. And these relate to the slightly higher order rights of management, the right to make decisions about how to use the asset, exclusion and alienation, which we just sort of mentioned. And so what we suggest is often project managers are actually seeking to change patterns of use and patterns of control. And in the literature, patterns of control are usually seen as more definitively linked to gender equity. So we might be especially interested in those. But on the other hand, use might be the more short-term, more sensitive in terms of time, a set of indicators, because it might be patterns of use that change first. That is possible. So we think it's worth having indicators of use as separate from indicators of control. And then this also helps the project manager think through, which of these am I more interested in? Are both equally relevant? Which of these seem to suit my project better? And then in this literature, ownership is strictly speaking a superset of all these 5 rights. So if you have all these 5 rights, you are an owner. But of course, we know that ownership in practice can mean very different things across contexts. Again, the right to alienate may or may not exist. The right to exclude may or may not exist. And, so when we ask questions about ownership using the word ownership, this may capture differing bundles of rights in different contexts. So of course, there is now a little more data on ownership than we had before. And so of course, we encourage, the use of that data, but with a great deal of caution that it may not be easy to aggregate this across different contexts. And so we have to be really careful about that. So on this first conceptual criterion, our recommendations are the following. We need indicators of use and control separately. We treat control as more definitively linked to gender equity, but maybe use is more likely to change in the short run. And we, suggest using data on ownership with caution, and where possible, let's try to target the rights that we're interested in. If we're interested in the right to exclude, maybe we, if in an ideal world, we'd be able to ask questions about that right, rather than use the term ownership, which again changes meaning without very carefully trained enumerators. Okay, so let me again actually pause. Questions? Clarification?
I don't think there's questions at this point. There's some comments, but those can come back up as in the Q&A time.
Okay, sounds good. All right. Okay, so the next conceptual issue is whether we're interested in de facto patterns of rights, use and control and ownership, or de jure. And, what we suggest is preferring de facto de jure. So de facto patterns are more likely to reflect the reality on the ground. And de jure rights, the legal system may change without substantive changes in patterns of use and control. Of course, there's some literature that suggests that legal changes are also very important, and of course they are. But again, in terms of the impact of a project, we have to choose. We argue for preferring, trying to capture de facto changes. And also, as we know now quite well, marginalized groups, ethnically, racially, and of course, in many contexts, women have less access to formal legal processes and are less able to make de jure claims to resources. So their claims to resources are often based on custom, tradition, and so on and so forth. So we want to recognize and validate those rights as well. So we ask that we think about de facto patterns of change and think about indicators that might capture those. And then, the question of joint versus sole decision making is again a really important one in the context of gender. So first, let's start out by saying that joint rights in decision making are not necessarily equal, right? We know that that is not true. We also know that women are much more likely to say, if you ask them about decision making, they're much more likely than men to say that they make decisions with their husband, father, mother, brother-in-law, whoever the other members of the family may be. So they're much more likely to exercise rights jointly. And again, these are not necessarily equal rights. Nevertheless, failing to capture women's claims in a joint sense, their joint rights, and their exercise of those joint rights would miss a really important part of the empirical reality. And so we really think that, we need to have indicators that include joint as well as sole participation in decision making and rights. And furthermore, of course, from the sort of larger perspective, our vision for gender equity is a vision of shared access and rights, and of equal and joint rights exercised together by men and women. And so in that sense, too, we want to validate the concept of the joint exercise of rights. So we recommend that indicators of use, control, and ownership should include joint as well as sole rights and participation in decision making, and combine the two. But again, because we might be interested in the trends, the disaggregated trends, we should also collect data for sole and joint separately and then combine them together into our gender gap indicator so that if needed, we can go back to the disaggregated data. And again, of course, this is in an ideal situation where we're able to collect all this data. Okay, so another point that I think has been made quite extensively within the CGIAR by Cheryl and Agnes and others is that the analysis of female-headed versus male-headed households is really not a gendered analysis. There are many reasons for this. One, male-headed household is often a misnomer. It's a mislabeling of a household that actually does contain a man and a woman, a principal couple. So it's actually a dual-headed household, as opposed to a household where the principal adult is a single male. And that's how we think about female-headed households. The principal adult is a single woman. And so the parallel concept is not always, or that concept is not always followed in the use of the term male-headed household. Secondly, of course, obviously, a majority of men and women live in dual-headed households. So if we want to capture the impacts of our projects and how they're changing the situation on the ground, and we do not explore what is happening in dual-headed households, that is really, missing most of the story. And so we really need to capture the impacts of agricultural interventions upon men and women in dual and single-headed households, but keeping in mind issues of resource intensity of data. We don't necessarily say that we have to interview men and women within the same household. Instead, and the Findex data set is a model for this, and we talk about that in the paper. This is from the World Bank. We can achieve this outcome by interviewing a single respondent in each household that we're surveying, as long as women respondents are adequately represented in the sample. So, this would then make this less burdensome for the data collection exercise. So that's another recommendation. And then another one that we have is to try to measure the value as well as quantity of resources used, controlled, and owned. And this is a really difficult one in many contexts, but it's worth keeping in mind, even if we cannot always fulfill it. So by value of resource, I mean the sale or rental price of a resource. And as we know, in the absence of thick markets for resources, this is a number that's very hard to pin down. And there may be differing sort of views on what that number should be. So this is, methodologically very difficult to capture. But I guess the interesting conceptual point here is that these measures are actually likely to be much more sensitive to project impacts. As you can, kind of visualize, when you introduce irrigation onto land, the price of land is likely to change much faster than the amount of land that is held by a woman. So that's just worth keeping in mind. And again, this is a logistically difficult idea, but it is a criteria that we thought was worth spelling out. So where context permits, we should try to capture data on the value of resources controlled, used and owned. Before I move on to the criteria relating to measurement issues, these are our 5 conceptual criteria. Let me pause again and see if there's any clarificatory questions.
I don't see any.
Okay, all right, great. All right, so the measurement criteria, I think, many of you have probably thought about these in great detail. Well, obviously, everything I've talked about so far requires a quantitative measure. Right? We're talking about gender gaps going up or down. We need a quantitative measure, but we need qualitative validation. For example, only if sale and rental markets are thick enough can we collect data on the value of indicators. So, we all realize, I think, the importance of qualitative validation of those quantitative measures. And then, if you're measuring the impacts of a project, you necessarily need data to be collected at multiple points in time. And other than a few current projects, such as the WEA and the FINDEX, there's very little out there that systematically collects data at multiple points in time. So this is really a big gap that we need to fill. And in terms of shaping the indicators that we recommend, what this means is that we have to pick data categories that are not very seasonal, that are going to be consistent across time. And of course, we must make sure that the data collection is relatively time and cost effective. Otherwise, it's not going to happen in the second and third round, right? It's not going to be feasible. So for example, when we talk about time use, we suggest the choice of recall rather than the use of time diaries, which are much more resource intensive, but maybe superior in terms of the quality of the data. And then, of course, we also need data that are easily replicable across sites, countries, or regions, because we're talking about trying to find national and international level indicators. And, we all know the importance of context. So this is a very difficult criterion to satisfy. But without it, we really can't draw generalizable conclusions about the impact of projects. And so we end up choosing broader measures and indicators rather than more specific ones sometimes for this reason. So we might want to aggregate across all forms of livestock or across all forms of financial assets because, we don't want something that's too context specific. And as I mentioned earlier, another way to kind of deal with the problem of resource intensity is to try to find indicators for which data is already being collected at scale. So again, where possible, we recommend indicators that are already being used in versions by the DHS or the FINDEX or the WEA and so on. And so they sort of piggyback on data that has already been collected, or they could be collected by including some relatively, straightforward additions to existing surveys. So that also shapes the indicators that we recommend. But of course, again, because for many of these indicators, the data is not being collected, this has to be accompanied by lobbying for the additional questions that we think these surveys should include. And then last but certainly not least, and also quite challenging, is if we're really interested in project impacts in a 3 to 5 year range, we want to focus on gaps related to use, although we think control is more closely related to gender equity. So there are some pros and cons there. There's a balancing act. And also the value of resources might be much more sensitive in the short run rather than the quantity of resources. And the latter in particular, as I already mentioned, is certainly something that we have to work on. And at this point in time, as you'll see, these relatively simple criteria, especially the measurement ones, are actually hard to meet at this point because we don't actually have enough data that is currently widely available that would meet all of these criteria. So we go ahead and recommend indicators that satisfy at least some of these criteria. And again, I think one of the outcomes of this is to sort of suggest additional questions in these surveys. So, let me pause again and see if there are any questions.
Not particularly. There's a bunch of discussion about the WEA, and we'll come back
Okay.
and how this relates to the
Okay.
WEA, and we can come back to that at the end.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, wonderful. All right, so I am not going to walk you through all the recommended indicators, but you have a sense of the criteria that we use to try to build out this menu that we've tried to present to you. And so there are separate indicators of use and control where possible, disaggregated by resource type. As you go through the paper, you'll see little boxes by resource type. Now, we don't actually discuss indicators of ownership or anything other than land and livestock. You know, when you think about labor power or common pool resources, or even financial assets in a certain sense, and we can talk about that more, use and control appear to be useful axes, but ownership does not always fit. And in the case of income, furthermore, we find that the separation of use and control does not appear to make quite as much sense. And so we suggest indicators that combine use and control. And with labor power, while we discuss indicators of control as opposed to use of labor power, particularly control over the labor power of others, we don't actually find a lot of literature that really uses those indicators or uses that sort of concept. And so, you know, we don't have enough literature to base recommendations on. So again, we sort of discuss what some of those indicators could look like, but we don't actually make any recommendations there. And then again, if you look at the appendix to the paper, we provide possible formulae, depending on feedback and comments, of course, for calculating each indicator, and also summarize what's in the discussion and the text of the paper in terms of some of the possible problems and weaknesses of the indicators. So again, there is no perfect indicator. And we really have to balance some of the upsides and downsides and sort of create a submenu of indicators that might be useful for a particular project. So just to give you an example, I just thought I'd show you what we did for financial assets. And so these are what we're calling the indicators of gender gaps in use of financial assets. And what you see is a proportion of women and men who are banked in a formal sector institution. As separately, the proportion of women and men who are members of microfinance and ROSCA groups. You see a possible formula for calculating that, in the second column. And then you see, a very brief, sort of summary of the important caveat that we might have for using this particular indicator in terms of its link to gender equality. So, for example, just because you have a bank account, doesn't necessarily mean you're actively using it. Or you have what we would call control over it, right? So use as opposed to control. So this is an indicator of use, and obviously it does not correlate necessarily with control. And then you can see that these first two indicators are available through the Findex, which means we have multiple points in time and we have multiple country level data already available. So project managers might be able to piggyback off that. That data already exists. You can use that, or you can use the same indicator at a regional level if you are able to collect primary data. And then we also point out, just to go back, contexts where this indicator may not be applicable from a replicability context. So again, we know that there are some countries where banks and formal sector institutions are really not widely accessible. There's not a wide network. So that's a place where that first indicator may not make much sense. Similarly, you may have a very weak network of microfinance institutions in some contexts. So again, this may not be an appropriate indicator in such a context. And then we have some thoughts on whether they're relatively short to medium term, whether they change relatively quickly, or we feel they're more rooted in deep-seated gender norms and therefore are much more likely to be sticky. And so again, you see those first two are short to medium term. And then, maybe I won't walk through every one of them. We can always come back and talk about it if you have questions. And maybe I'll just show you the similar table for control over financial assets. So as I mentioned, use and control is two slightly different things. So with control, we're talking much more about decision making. So the proportion of women and men who decided how to use the loan and savings amounts, and of course, this is conditional upon actually saving or receiving a loan, and the proportion of women and the proportion of men who acquired an ownership stake in the asset where the loan was used, to build assets. And there's some literature and some evidence from the gender asset gap studies that this might be an important indicator. And of course, it feeds back into women's ability to control assets and own assets. And then third, the proportion of women and the proportion of men who are responsible for repayment of the loan. Again, there's a literature that suggests that this might be a really significant responsibility in the context of who is perceived to be controlling the loan. And the downside here is, of course, that in the case of a debt cycle, this is an onerous responsibility. So, again, there's this indicator may or may not correlate with women's empowerment. If women are indeed responsible for the loan, it will depend on the context. So that's an example of how we try to separate out use and control, make some suggestions for indicators, and then, sort of self-evaluate or criticize those, provide some critique of each of the indicators to help people think through them and how useful they are. And then the last thing I want to do in my part of the presentation before we go to Q&A is to also. Sorry, Cheryl, I forgot to stop. Go ahead.
Yeah, we did actually have a clarifying question on this one, which is, yes. Can you clarify what the basis is for the time sensitivity columns and what that means?
So again, in most cases, we do not have empirical studies that actually test these indicators over time. So none of these three, for example, are from the Findex, which would have at least 2 points in time. So what we argue in the paper is, where we think the ability to participate in decision making is rooted in long-standing gender norms, and is less directly under the control of somebody who is, let's say, a project manager for a project. We think those might take longer to change. And again, we don't have empirical validation for that yet. Hopefully we will as more studies are done. And so, for example, you can issue a loan and you can say that, the woman is responsible for the loan. So, for example, in microfinance groups, the women members of the group are often the ones who are pursued for repayment of the loan. And again, there's a literature about the upsides and downsides of that. But the woman sort of becomes responsible, right? So there seems to be an ability to sort of shape that in the short term as we set up these groups. However, what actually happens when she enters her household and who actually makes the decision about how to use that money that she is responsible for repaying, we have much less direct insight or control over that. So we feel that decision-making question might be a more long-term one. So it's sort of more, at this point, unfortunately, that is sort of what this is based on, rather than empirical validation. I don't know if that's...
That's fine.
That's fine for now. Okay. All right. We can again come back to that. Okay. And then again, based on this particular evaluation of short versus long term, we create, for example, so again, putting yourselves in the shoes of somebody who's looking for short to medium term indicators. Here's a sub menu that you might create. And again, this uses multiple resources, and you may be interested in a subset of these resources. But this is a menu that you might create for yourself. And this is something that Jackie Ashby, who is, really important in getting the study going, was very interested in. And so you could think of this as a sort of dashboard of indicators and across maybe a few different resources that allow you to kind of think about project impacts in the short to medium term at a somewhat disaggregated level, and maybe allow you to course correct when you start to notice some of these indicators moving in surprising or unexpected directions. Again, you can see in the data already available column, and again, we're thinking of these at the national level and international level, that even most of these, we really don't have data that is easily available at this point. So that lobbying effort for inclusion of some of these questions in large-scale surveys, I think, is really important. And this could be done for national surveys. Again, I'm from India. And we have, NSS and other surveys that are actually quite respected, that are done, every few years. And so the lobbying effort here would be to try to include some of this, some of these in, questions in those existing surveys, so that we actually have some good data across a large scale for some of these indicators. So that is what I wanted to present for today, and I will stop there, and maybe we can go to questions.
Great. This is Cheryl. Thank you. That was quite helpful. I thought I would, since I'm the moderator, just start by doing a little bit of clarification that some of the side questions that came up during her presentation. I think what we're really looking for with these kinds of indicators is to figure out some measures that we can use to look at the overall impacts of not specific projects, but all of the work that the CG is doing. Kind of a big challenge, but that's what we were asked to do. And to think about, right, how do we measure these IDOs at the national level, right? And so what we asked Smriti to do is to look at what's currently available, what data is, what's out there now that could be used that we could measure these two big goals, the two IDOs that we're interested in measuring about control over resources and women's decision making. And so the paper actually goes through much more detail on where these kinds of indicators are. And there are some of them that are currently available in some of these nationally representative surveys. And then I think she's also done a nice job of really indicating which things are not yet available, but would be good indicators and would be really easy to collect. I think this goes to, Katie had asked a question a little bit ago about the intersection of gender with all of these other identities, age, race, ethnicity, class, geographical and social locations, etc. And I think clearly those are important. And clearly to really understand what's going on at a local level, we have to look at all of those. What these indicators are doing is trying to come up with a few indicators at the national level that could look at the impact of what's going on women, right? So very different levels that these kinds of things would be looking at. So I don't think anybody's suggesting that we not look at those. Clearly, those are really would be really key for any kind of project level work. But again, what the IDOs were trying to push all the centers to look at is what is the overall impact on women of all of the work that's being done. So these national level indicators.
Right.
I thought I would turn it over either to Agnes or to Hazel to say a little bit about how some of these tie in with the WEA, how they're different from the WEA. Clearly, a number of the indicators, specific indicators that Smriti is recommending, are very closely related to some of the disaggregated data that's being collected in the WEA.
Right. I think in the appendix, we actually do reference WEA as a data source for several of these, the time used, the leisure, et cetera, et cetera. So absolutely.
Hi, this is Agnes. I just wanted to follow up on the question on the way, Smriti. I think you were taking questions from people who had sent in questions in advance. And I think the question about the way of being very aggregative and not providing the information that project managers would need is not entirely correct, because the way itself is based on extremely disaggregated data, which are aggregated up into indicators.
Right.
So because it's an additive index, it also is decomposable into its component indicators, and so those indicators are at the level, I think, of detail that project managers would need.
Right. And in fact, the places where the indicators recommended overlap with the disaggregated WEA data is an indicator, sub-indicators are actually referenced in the paper. So I think that would become, it's one of the few sources of data that we have for at least some of these indicators. And I think when you look at the appendix, I think I sort of showed financial assets, or even in this dashboard, you can kind of see that, the reason I don't say, you can see WEA mentioned for some of these indicators as a source of data. And the only reason there's a no in the first column is because it does not necessarily exist across a large range of countries, or the same number of countries as FINDEX or the World Development Indicators. But absolutely, in fact, where possible, definitions have been used that match up with WEA. Rather than trying to invent a new indicator. I think we have tried to sort of align those. So, again, this was certainly one of my first questions when I came in, because I was aware of the way of work, and I was, asking, how are these? And so there is an overlap, and these are complementary projects, I think. And the data collection exercise that WEA is engaged in is actually really important in terms of being able to, build out this list of indicators. Is how I understood it in the end. So maybe I guess go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I mean, I don't want to detract from the bigger discussions. I don't want this to be a WEA discussion. We can have this some other time.
Sure. Yeah, I think the idea is that this is not a way to measure empowerment. I think that was really the point that I was trying to get across, is none of these indicators by themselves or even as a group are necessarily going to measure empowerment as you have tried to capture it in the WEA. I think that's the point here.
I mean, even whether the WEA itself can capture empowerment is something that's very debatable. But I agree that
that's the attempt, right?
Yeah, you're not trying to capture empowerment, and that's fine, because a lot of the indicators you're looking at are simply not available at the gender disaggregated level for so many.
Right, exactly.
Establishing that baseline would be great.
Yeah, agreed. But yes, this was certainly one of my questions in the beginning. So.
Are there other questions or other comments or responses? I think that this is going to become part of a discussion among the gender network and various other people in the CG involved in gender to figure out what we want to be recommending using this paper, that she's done as the background. So, Hazel, I see you're want to ask a question?
Yes. Thanks, Cheryl. And thanks, Smriti. So my question is, so as Agnes was discussing, I was just reminded of the ongoing effort by FAO's Statistics Division to put together guidelines on the gender, integrating more gender agricultural surveys, national agricultural surveys, and use that. I mean, to what extent is this can be integrated into that effort, so that at least we have kind of a way to collect these at the national level?
I'm not sure how the advocacy goes from here. So we certainly reference the FAO for the, they have a version of the incidence of land management kind of indicator, but maybe I'll turn this over to Cheryl.
Yeah, that would be good, because I've just been involved. I was just in Rome having those conversations. There's several people who are involved in both the CG discussions about it and the FAO discussions about it. And I think there's a real interest in making sure that they overlap. At this point, I think this paper is farther along than what the FAO has come up with so far. But we certainly don't want to, in the end, be recommending anything that's quite different. Or actually, we might want to recommend something that's quite different, but we don't want to recommend something that's just slightly different from what they're doing. So I think as this process moves forward, you're right that it's really important to stay in touch with the folks at FAO who are developing those guidelines. And there is pretty good communication between the two.
Right.
Because if they can start figuring out how to get better data collected in the agricultural surveys, then we would have much better national level data on a lot of these issues.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Anyone else? Other questions or comments or reactions? Well, very good. Then, let's see. There was another question early on, but I'm not sure it's a little bit of a tangent from what we're talking about today. I think it's a really good question, as saying
Right.
That there's a tendency to add a chapter regarding gender at the very end of every report. Furthermore, almost often it's only the last indicator for a project has anything to do about gender. And do you think this can be a success for gender mainstreaming? Can it be viewed as good practice? And how can we further improve monitoring with regard to gender? And it goes on a bit. So I don't think that's a question that's about these particular indicators. I think this is a question that the Gender Network and maybe a future webinar could really have a discussion about. I do think that having better indicators, so if some of these started to be more available and people, so these, I think some of the indicators that are going to come out of the project level WEA that's currently being developed may be ways for people to have better indicators that they can integrate into their projects. But until people start thinking about the gender at the beginning of the project rather than at the end of the project, I don't think it's going to really change. But that's my own take on it.
Yeah, and I remember looking at that question, and it had a second thing about, sort of trying to balance, do you advocate for changes in norms, or do you try to work within existing norms? And while it's not directly, I think we have the same issue with data, right? We want to work within the existing surveys, and especially when it comes to these national surveys and FAO surveys and so on, you want to try to pick indicators that will be, will be found useful by those surveys and easy to integrate. And yet at the same time, you're trying to study things that they are not necessarily focused on. So there's that balance between both trying to lobby for sort of, overarching change in how gender is approached, but also working within the institutional constraints and the resource constraints of generating this data. So I think that sort of struggle exists at this level too, for sure.
Great. We had a comment from Jackie.
Yes. Hi, Jackie.
Yeah, hi. Just coming back to that, the point you were covering about the indicators of mainstreaming, Cheryl, and I just wanted to say two things. First of all, I thought Smriti made a really important point about this paper is not really looking at necessarily at empowerment. And if you look at the IDOs that the Fund Council, mainly in their wisdom, came up with, although we did have some influence on it, they don't necessarily assume that empowerment is part of the picture. They talk about control over resources, but you're still a step away from, in the impact pathway, from empowerment if you're measuring some of these things. So that's one point I thought it was really worth emphasizing. And then with respect to the whole issue of mainstreaming, I think it's really important to differentiate these kinds of outcome indicators from the performance indicators, which we've been looking at. For example, in the annual reports, we have a set of performance indicators that we ask people to self-assess on, which look at how research is being done and what's called the institutional architecture. And so keeping a clear differentiation between these two kinds of indicators, I think they're both important, but you need to keep clear the difference between the two types.
Yeah.
That's my comment. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jackie. So, Katie, do you want to say something more about your comment that you've posted?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much for what I think is a really interesting both paper and presentation. And I guess this is just in my own struggles of working with data in Kenya and kind of complementing that with some exploratory qualitative work I've been able to do. So I guess my question really deals with, how sophisticated, first of all, of a definition of gender and gender dynamics can we really work with in the context of aggregating data at the national or international level without taking into account regional or local variance, which I know as complicating and messy a factor as that is, if that's what we're agreeing, is the basis of gender differences or construction of norms, how leaving that information out could really affect what our data is telling us as we kind of take it up each scale. So it's really this question of scaling up gender research, which I completely understand is something that the CG is trying to move towards, but at the same time, perhaps losing out as well on the overall explanatory power. So, we might end up with these great descriptive statistics of, again, men and women as these big categories, but again, without taking the smaller scale into account, what can that really tell us?
I completely agree go ahead, Cheryl.
I was just going to say, I mean, this is part of a much bigger discussion, right, about what is the right level to understand gender dynamics. And I think probably all of us would agree with your point that to really understand things, we need it much, much more disaggregated. And I guess the bigger question is there anything useful that the national level data can tell us, right? And it can only tell us a little bit, but is there any use for it? And I think the answer.
Hello.
Oh, sorry, I lost your audio.
Yes, me too.
Yes.
I can't.
Hi, I think Cheryl got disconnected for a second.
Oh.
Just stuck with her.
Is she back?
One minute.
Oh dear.
Well, again, in case she's not able to jump back on, I want to thank you for a very interesting presentation. I look forward to following up with the outcoming outputs from this publication, and I look forward to continuing this discussion within the Gender and Ag Network. Thank you.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, if I could just add, I don't know if Cheryl was going to say this, but I certainly think, none of this draws any causal links between anything. I mean, I really think, you look down that list of indicators and, the analytical piece of, what does it mean that one of these indicators goes up or down? I don't think this data obviously cannot tell us that. And, apart from, the qualitative work that's required to validate the use of the data in a particular context or the indicator, I think, sort of teasing out what exactly it means is again something that has to be, has to draw on some of the context specific work. So, I think this is descriptive statistics, and maybe what Cheryl was trying to say is that is useful to some extent. We can usually say some things, but only, but only a limited set of things. And I think a lot of the real analytics are probably, this is just the first step as opposed to the final step. So that's how I thought about it.
If I could just jump in, I'd really like to second that.
Right.
Smriti, that a descriptive statistic that enables you to say something about we're making small steps towards change can be very, very helpful. And one of the issues that some of the donors have brought up with me recently is that they are really urgent to see us reporting, positive change in the area of gender research. And the fact that this is, all relatively recent, it doesn't get a lot of, they don't cut you a lot of slack because of that. They have very high expectations, and so one of the things that I'm hoping that we can do over the next 12 to 15 months is see more reporting, in the annual reports and in the websites and so on. See more reporting that might make use of even just descriptive statistics using some of these suggestions, and not necessarily at a national scale. But this might help us to just take some small sort of baby steps towards being able to report more in terms of positive change. Thanks.
Thanks, Jackie.
Great, and I think Cheryl is back on.
Oh, yay, okay.
Yes, I'm back on. My internet just died for a second there. We had one other question, which is why you don't recommend to interview both male and female within the same household while collecting data for these indicators. That if we had data from both males and females in the same household, that would help us to understand the interaction between them.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think I remember going back and forth on this with Cheryl and Jackie, and that would be perfect. That would be great in a resource-intensive data collection world. I think absolutely. But especially when we're doing large samples, that could quickly become quite difficult, especially when we're thinking about something that can feasibly be done every few years. So we not only want to do the survey at one point in time, but you want to be able to do it at multiple points in time. So I think the resource intensity and feasibility of the data collection becomes even more important. And so it's not that we don't think it's very, very important and useful to have data from both members of the couple, principal couple, but rather that, this may be a workaround, around the problem of resource, and time intensity of data collection. Cheryl, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think the question is what data is needed to be able to create these national level indicators. And the point is that to be able to create these national level or these higher up level indicators, you don't have to have data from multiple people in the same household. If you want to do inter-household analyses, you do need data from different people within the household. Although actually a lot of the inter-household analyses were not done with data collected from individuals within the household, but data collected by one person within the household that provided information on who owns what, or one person who answers questions about who makes decisions, right? So there's a difference between data on individuals within households and who we collect data from. The WEA is collecting data from both men and women within households. So that data is really rich at being able to do that. Agnes suggests that some of the LSMS is doing that as well, and I think some of it is, and some of it suggests that it is, and they're actually just interviewing whoever they can get a hold of that particular day. So it depends on the particular context. So I think that the question is, right, what data do we need to be able to do these national level indicators? And we don't necessarily for that have to interview multiple people within the same household. We need to interview and get answers from both men and women. But if we want to do inter-household analyses, then we do need very detailed data from individuals within households.
Right. And I think, part of that, the moving away from thinking that, the man is going to be the most well-informed member of the household. And so, I guess there's issues, but even I think conceptually, just thinking, we can find out about the household by interviewing a female respondent, I think is not necessarily is something that takes a while to adjust to. So that's another piece of this, which is somewhat interesting.
So again, the purpose of this was not to suggest how to go out and collect data on projects, but to think about what national level data might be available, either currently is available or could pretty easily be made available by adding questions to existing surveys that could help develop these national level indicators.
Right.
Anything else? Great. Well, then I think we will thank you very much, Smriti, for coming and leading this webinar today. I think these discussions through the Gender Network will continue. So if you have other thoughts or other reactions to particular things, you can send them in. And I presume there'll be something more formal organized with the Gender Network to discuss this. Wonderful. And what we want to do with it.
Right. Thank you all for having me.
Cheryl. Thanks to you both and everyone who participated today. We'll make sure that the webinar and the recording and the presentation will be available to everyone. And we'll also pick up on the various threads that I think Cheryl did pick up as what would be discussed further throughout the network. So we will make an online space available for you to comment and continue with these questions and also make sure that we picked up on any sort of questions and comments that people might get back to us with following this webinar as well. So thanks to all of you. Thank you, Cheryl, for moderating, and Smriti for presenting, and also for our audience for the very lively discussion. We really appreciate that. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye now. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.